My talk tonight is about compassion, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, and my experience with this superhero of a Buddhist archetype who became important to me because I had a few things to work out. When I first started practicing, I doubted my capacity for compassion, and I resisted the whole Bodhisattva ideal. I had practiced meditation off and on since 1973, not knowing anything about Zazen or Zen teachings. I simply felt drawn to sitting in silence and breathing. But on my own, I wasn't able to sustain a practice. So about 9 years ago, I sought support at the Minnesota Zen Center, but only for my sitting practice. And when this Bodhisattva business and saving all beings entered into it, I would get agitated. So I simply put it aside for a while. And I continued to sit Zazen every morning. And I attended all of the sessions. And deep wounds, I thought I'd already dealt with, and deep sadness came up and seemed bottomless. And practicing self-compassion was suggested to me, and I felt as uncomfortable with that as I did with the Bodhisattva ideal, which with I felt no real genuine connection. But as I continued to sit, I started to see the fear under my resistance. I was afraid that the Bodhisattva vow to save all beings was just another way to get me to do what other people wanted me to do, to be what other people wanted me to be. And I'd been down that road before. But gradually, sitting uncovered my belief, my real belief that I had an inability to love and that I had a heart of stone. And I felt horribly sad to admit this and terribly ashamed. But I didn't know what to do about it, and I had nowhere else to go. So I kept sitting. Then the first time I heard Case 89 in the Blue Cliff Records, something shifted in me. Case 89 is the koan about Avalokiteshvara's multiple hands and eyes that extend from her body and reaching for a pillow in the night. So to paraphrase the story, two Dharma brothers are talking. The younger one asks the older, "What does Avalokiteshvara do with all those hands and eyes?" And the older monk says, "It's like reaching for a pillow in the night." And the younger one says, "Oh, I understand, I get it." And the older monk says, "What do you understand?" And the younger says, "Avalokiteshvara's whole body is covered with hands and eyes." 80% right, the older monk says. Avalokiteshvara is nothing but hands and eyes. Well, first take, I didn't quite grasp the koan, but something tugged at me. It's reaching for a pillow in the night. I felt it in my body. Something about compassion being instinctive and reflexive, even natural. And this was important to me. Maybe compassion wasn't something I had to go get to fix my heart of stone. I didn't deliberately work on the koan, but over time, the koan seemed to work on me. And what happened was that two memories came back to me. I was not quite 3 years old when my sister was born, and I wasn't all that excited about her arrival. I called her girl rather than use her name, for example. What was going on, even at age 3, was that I felt in a precarious position regarding my parents' affection and attention. There just wasn't enough of it to go around. And then a few months later, I was in the kitchen with my mother when the baby woke up crying, and my mother dispatched me to see to her. When I opened the bedroom door, I saw that my sister's eyes were completely crusted over. She had pink eye, but I didn't know that. I took one look at her and burst into tears. "The baby's blind," I said. And I remember feeling fiercely protective of this baby sister with whom I competed for a place of attention and affection in our family. There really wasn't enough love to go around in our home. Love existed, but none of us had access to it. My father suffered from alcoholism, and my mother had a severe, undiagnosed mental illness. Even as a child, I felt desperate for a sense of order and approval, and I suppose for love. And I tried to be whoever I thought everyone needed me to be to get it. So by the end of high school, I was emotionally numb, confused, and full of resentment, but I didn't know it. And as I grew into adulthood, I became an alcoholic like my father, and my relationship with my parents, especially with my mother, grew more tangled and more painful. Decades later, after my father died, we moved our mother to assisted living in Minneapolis, where I live, and where she stayed for 11 years. I had stopped drinking by then, and I practiced the 12 steps, but I didn't have Zazen. My mother's emotional needs were great, and I often felt as if I had to make a choice between my life or hers. And for peace of mind, the deal I made with myself was that I would visit her every Saturday, which I did do, but I dreaded those visits. I begrudged her that time. She would even have to ask me to take off my coat. I wanted to be a good daughter, but I didn't know how to do what I thought a good daughter should do without getting swallowed up. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing to feel as though you can't love your mother. When she was 88 years old, she was hospitalized with pneumonia. And I spent a lot of time with her, not knowing if she was dying or just sick. Then one morning, soon after she returned from the hospital to the nursing home, I stopped to see her and found her just shriveled up in bed in terrible physical pain. And the nurse was trying to keep her from pulling out the catheter. It was the month of March, and I was wearing a big winter coat, which I took off and threw on a chair. And for some reason, I can still hear the heavy sound of it landing. And I got on the bed with my mother, and I told her to pull on my hand instead of the catheter. And she did, and I held her and I rocked her. And I did this without thinking. I take no credit for it. It was instinctive. It was an action that came out of nowhere from a place of not knowing, like reaching for the pillow in the night. And it occurred to me later that in memory, my mother and I had never actually touched before. And then 2 days later, I was with her when she died. So the memory of my sister as a baby and of my mother dying gave me a window into my compassionate nature once I was practicing Zen, which, and this compassionate nature we know as Zen practitioners is our true nature, but one I had lost touch with at an early age. Part of our Zen practice is to cultivate attributes or virtues such as generosity and patience and compassion. But cultivating compassion was another part of the practice that gave me pause at first. Even my attempts at self-compassion seemed to hit hard rock. But through the koan, I started to reconsider that maybe compassion already existed within me and within everyone, except that there is no within or without exactly. But maybe being compassionate or having compassion wasn't a matter of adding something, but of letting something drop away, something as the tyrannical ego that drove my desires and fueled my afflictions, the afflictions that I had become painfully familiar with in Zazen. Maybe compassion was like Dogen's practice enlightenment. We're already enlightened and we sit to realize it. We're already compassionate and that's why we cultivate it. I could open my mind to this possibility. Maybe even like Avalokiteshvara, we are nothing but compassion. The Nobel Prize winner in poetry, Louise Gluck, was recently interviewed about her writing habits. She said that after her first book, she noticed that all of her poems were comprised of short sentences. Short sentences. She realized that to change that pattern, she would have to break a technical habit. So she forced herself to write poems in only long sentences. She had to be patient. It took a long time to change. But she said, I found out there was another way I could sound. What I found out was that I was used to the sound of my own suffering. Maybe it was Avalokiteshvara who helped me to hear the pattern of my suffering and to see how I separated and divided things up. Maybe it was Avalokiteshvara who helped me discover that there was another way I could sound. I've noticed a not so subtle difference between forcing myself to be compassionate, or what I think is compassionate, and allowing compassion, or just getting out of the way. Forcing seems like a should. It comes from my head. And in me, it's motivated by fear. Allowing compassion seems to come from surrender, from a moment of not knowing, with no sense of gain or loss. And I feel it in my body, grounded and present. That might be why I remember my hot tears as a 3-year-old when I saw my sister suffering, and why I remember the heavy sound of my coat landing on the chair at my mother's bedside. These are physical sensations, physical memories making their way to the heart. Lately, I've been reading some of the commentaries on Case 89, Dogen's, where he says one thing and then contradicts it, and the dialogue between Hongsha and Wangsang, where Hongsha asks, what are the hands and eyes throughout the body? And Wangsang says, cat. And that's C-A-T, cat. To this discourse, John Dato Lari commented, don't you see? Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva has never understood compassion. Maybe Luri and others are cautioning us not to be too sure of our ideas about compassion. In any given situation, we may not see the full expression of it. As Zen teacher Francis Carney says, sometimes the compassionate choice doesn't look like compassion to our limited understanding. Such a possibility has shed light on my troubled relationship with my mother. Day to day, over the years, I struggled to handle it. There was so much suffering, hers and mine. But ultimately, it was the suffering that allowed compassion to arise. I'm reminded that I don't know what is actually happening under the surface, beyond the words and the ideas of what seems to be my life. I can't know. We practice in the dark. And it's useless for me to be flipping the light switch on all the time, trying to evaluate what I think I see. Still, even in the midst of life's ambiguity, we cultivate. We cultivate compassion because it's human nature to be self-absorbed and fearful. And as bodhisattvas, we make an effort to temper the tyranny of the ego and to simply get out of the way. In my attempts to cultivate compassion, I've taken up various exercises, such as the Dalai Lama's 4 practices, which you may be familiar with. I've also practiced the Brahma Viharas, which are otherwise called the faces of compassion: goodwill, sympathetic joy, equanimity, and compassion itself. But the best practice for me was something I was almost already doing and didn't even realize it. I heard a talk from Green Gulch that reminded me of Suzuki Roshi's warm-hearted Zazen, where you simply take care of each breath. Zazen without warmth, Suzuki said, is dry. More important than posture and counting or other details, counting the breath. Is this warmth, warm Zazen? That really affected me. Taking care of each breath is a practice of cultivating compassion for myself. I think that my deep need for that practice may have been what drew me to Zazen in the first place, before I even knew what Zazen was. And if I take care of my own breath, it can't help but overflow into the rest of my life. And that's why I sit. I sit so that I have something to give. And that's what I have to share with you tonight.